Vertel waar zit ik?
Success up there. Yeah. Hey! Welcome everybody to a new episode of the Beardbarian. My name is Yves and I am the Beardbarian. Now, today we're going to talk about Trappist ales and their history and about the misconceptions you will often hear about these beers. What, first of all, is the difference between a Trappist beer and just any regular kind of beer? Now, to be qualified as a Trappist ale, you have to follow a certain set of rules. First of all, the beer has to be made in a monastery by Trappist monks of the Trappist order, or at least the sales have to be supervised by those monks. Now, that poses a lot of questions. First of all, what if a beer is made by monks that are not of the Trappist order? Well, then we obviously don't speak about the Trappist ale, we just talk about an abbey ale. Another thing that's also an abbey ale, but has really nothing to do with monks, is if the brewery, if a really commercial brewery just makes beer mentioning monks on the label, using an old monastery recipe, or sometimes pays a monastery to use the name. But those are definitely not Trappist ales. Never be misguided by bar owners, by barmaids telling you, oh, this is a Trappist ale, if it's just a regular abbey ale. If it's a Trappist ale, it will have the authentic Trappist logo somewhere on the label. I will show you later what that logo looks like. Another part of the rules is that the money the monks make by selling the beer has to be spent either on the monastery for the upkeep, the living quarters, the feeding of the monks, or if they have made too many profits, they have to invest the money in charity. So, if you want to make this world a better place, drink Trappist beers. Another very important rule that has to do with the making of Trappist ales is that they have to make use of a local water source. Now, for example, the Rochefort Trappist ale, one of my personal favorites, they get their water coming right out of the rocks where their monastery is built. Now, just a few hundred meters further, a little bit far away from the monastery, there is a very big digging company. They're digging into the rock, and for a few times there's been a huge risk of the water source of the monastery being spoiled by those digging works. In other words, had the digging works gone wrong, the monastery would no longer have had access to the local water source, and it would no longer be a Trappist ale. Now, you might have noticed I didn't say a word about quality. Trappist label is not a quality label. Doesn't mean the beers aren't good. In fact, due to the traditions, due to the regulations of these monasteries, their beers are very often excellent, but they might as well just produce a beer that's average or even less than average. It's up to you. I'm not gonna make any bad names here. You'll just have to try all of them. Now, what Trappist monasteries do we have nowadays in the world? There are 6, or there used to be 6 in Belgium. There are 2 in the Netherlands, there's 1 in the United States, there's 1 in Austria, and there's also 1 in the UK. Now, as for Belgium, it's very logical that we have a lot of Belgian Trappist monasteries, because this is where the original Trappist monks, the monks coming from the monastery of La Trappe in France, came after their monastery had been dissolved. Now, as they came here, they created new monasteries, and of course, they took their tradition of brewing beer with them. First one was the brewery or monastery of Westmalle. Westmalle, to be honest, was one of my first big beers I got in touch with. It's a really nice, accessible blonde beer of 9.5% ABV, so that's really strong. I am familiar with a lot of people coming from the United States, coming from the UK, being used to their softer, don't want to say weak, but softer blonde ales. They get in touch with the Westmalle Triple and they just down it and they get struck by motherfucking lightning. Because it's quite a heavy beer. Now, what makes it very dangerous is that due to the kind of yeast they use, it has a very fruity flavor. You smell bananas in there. Doesn't taste like bananas, but you have a very fruity touch to it, which makes it almost feel like it's a drink you can indeed just down like that. But be careful with it. If you're into the Westmalle Blonde, I can also advise you the Dark Westmalle. It's a completely different beer, very caramelized, but also a very, very good beer. And has a little less alcohol in it, so you can drink more of it if you really want to enjoy it. So today I'm going to tell a bit more about how exactly I got into beer, why I love beer, and why beer is an integral part of Beardbarian entertainment. Now, don't be shocked, some parts of the story might be weird to you due to cultural differences, but in general, I think by telling these things I learn you a bit more about Belgium, and you'll definitely get more insight about why I do the things the way I do them. Now, the story of me getting into beer starts with my grandma. I spent an awful lot of time with her when I was a child, when my parents were at work, obviously. And part of growing up with my grandma was drinking table beer during dinner. Now, table beer in general are very light beers. They're like 1-2%. So it's not like I got drunk by drinking it, and it was for a very, very long time part of Belgian tradition. Children would drink table beer, adults would drink table beer with their food because it was seen as nutritious, was seen as healthy. So I enjoyed it, never got drunk. And I think it's very interesting to stress those cultural differences. I know in a lot of Anglo-Saxon countries it's a very big taboo to drink alcohol when you're under 18, when you're under 21. But here in Belgium it was very common to drink alcohol as a child, albeit in small volumes. Now, it didn't turn me into a raging alcoholic. I still drink only like alcohol on 2 or 3 days of the week. And I do occasionally go on benders, of course, but it's not because I drank as a child that I now am a raging alcoholic. There's plenty of raging alcoholics out there that didn't drink as a child. All in all, I think it taught me a very important relationship between man and beer. Now, that's the beginning, of course. I was a very young child. It had very little influence on how I grew up, on how I see beer, but I do like to think it had some kind of importance. It's a very fun starting point for this story. Now, the first time I actually realized what beer was about and what I really see as the start of my beer-loving life was my dad's advice. At one point, my dad sat down with me and he said to me, "Son, I think it's important that there's a lot of good beers out there in the world. There's a lot of very tasty alcohol out there, and you should go for the high quality stuff. You should go for really good beers, crafted with respect for tradition, crafted with insight in a recipe, and I would much prefer you drinking one or two of those than that you will ever just get into Pilsner and drink a lot of that shite. So that was a very important part of our advice. I think I got it when I was about late 14, early 15 years old. And around that time, my parents very often went to a certain restaurant in the neighborhood. And this old man worked there. This old man stood behind the bar. And around that time, the guy steps up to our table and he says, so, this little kid likes beer. He saw me nipping off of my dad's glass, have a little taste. It was very common for my dad, if he drank a special beer, to have me let a taste. And the guy brought me a beer. There I was, like 14, 15 years old, and this guy brings me a full beer, my first real full glass of good Belgian ale. And he didn't just give it to me. I think that makes a very big difference. He didn't just give it to me. He started to explain, okay, swirl it around in your glass, smell it, taste it, go looking for these and these tastes. Go looking for the taste of bread, go looking for the taste of lemon, and then pour the last bit of your bottle. Pour the yeast in and try to find differences. He kind of challenged me to go look for more in beer than just, oh, swig it down and yeah, let's look at the drunk kid. No, this was actually an educational moment, and I think it changed me forever. And I loved it. Every time afterwards, when we went to that restaurant, not every time, but very often, whenever the guy had a new beer on his menu, he would come to me and explain to me the flavors that you could find in there and how it was made, all the big differences. So that's where I really got into beer, where I really developed respect for the drink. Now, in Belgium, the legal age for drinking is 16. So what the guy was doing is legally seen not okay, but I gotta remind you, this is Belgium. We have a culture where drinking children was normal. So in a cultural sense, it was normal. Now, I did become 16 shortly after. And when I went to high school in Dendermonde, on Thursdays, you could leave school. You could go out in town, take your sandwiches with you, eat them somewhere on a bench in the park. But one of my best friend's grandmother was running this really old, dark pub. She didn't work behind the bar anymore, she was just sitting there playing cards, but she always welcomed us very heartily. And the guy behind the bar was also very much into beer. He would offer us like these really strange beers from time to time, tell us a little bit of myths and stories about beer. But it was a very fun afternoon break, which developed my interest in beer even more. And then of course, very big jump was going to university in Ghent, where there are a lot of pubs. Some of these pubs offer over 300 kinds of beer, so that's where I really started to explore more and more breweries. And it was in Ghent that my professional interest in beer got its first little push in the back. When I started becoming a free walking tour guide, the company I started walking for also offered beer tastings, and the guy running the business said, oh, if you should come and see one of my beer tastings, it's gonna be fun, we're gonna try a few different beers, you get to meet more tourists, and you'll see another part of the business. So I went, and it was fun. I mean, you drink beer, you listen to a guy telling stories, and I said, okay, I want to do this as well. And shortly after, I started doing beer tastings for this guy in a few youth hostels in Ghent. Now, I gotta admit, it was fun. Customers liked it. It was very often their first encounter with Belgian beer. But there were quite a lot of myths and lies in the guy's story. Lies that I very often copied in the beginning because I didn't know any better. For example, a common myth you'll often hear is that, oh, a triple beer has fermented 3 times. It was a story I actually took with me for a very long time. Even when I was training new beer tasters, I copied that story. But as I studied more at the university, I discovered the importance of double checking your sources, controlling your stories, and also just my love for beer grew, and I felt the urge to go visit breweries. I felt the urge to go to other beer tastings, and there I picked up a lot of that I was telling falsehoods, that I was telling lies. And I felt so ashamed because I had been telling very cheesy stories to customers that simply were not true, or sometimes not entirely true. So that's where I started changing my stories, where I started learning more, reading more books about beer, actually chasing that knowledge. And you know what? It adds a very different level of difficulty of creating your own beer tasting stories, because all those cheesy stories, you know, they're fun. That's why they're so successful. They're fun, they're easy to tell, they're easy to swallow. So I had to reshape my style of telling stories. I had to reinvent my own way of having a beer tasting. Because now you have to tell about science, you have to explain theories, you have to explain mechanics. You can't just talk about history of Belgian beer in terms of, oh, you know, we were making beer in the Middle Ages and poof, this is now the Belgian beer industry. You have to tell stories about international trade, you have to tell stories about developing science, developing parts of the culture. And to be honest, I think that's a lot more interesting, but it's very hard to condense that in a nice story that you can tell in about 2 or 3 hours. So it's definitely changed my ideas of how to guide, on how to do beer tastings, but I think it did it for the better. So this changed mentality, this changed approach helped me to become more professional in terms of beer. And soon I would get my first real jobs in the beer industry. First of all, there would be the beer walks. Now, I didn't exactly get into the beer walks through my love of beer. It was actually a very funny coincidence. I was a volunteer at a medieval festival, and the owner of that festival was also running a guided company that offered beer-based tours. And he offered me to work for them. And it was a lot of fun. I did walks in Ghent. I'm also in training for Antwerp and Bruges. So yeah, they basically take you from pub to pub, and while you walk, they tell you about the beer-related history of those towns. They also offer walking tours in Mechelen, in Leuven. So actually a lot of cities in Belgium where you can take these tours. So the combination of history, walking and drinking beer, of course, is what got me interested, and which makes it a very lovely activity, which I can really recommend. If you book with them, do ask for me. If I'm not available, you can get one of my lovely colleagues. It's all just lovely people. I mean, they all love history and beer. How can they be wrong people? So be sure to check out Beer Walks. Shortly after I joined Beer Walks, I also got work at Brewery Bostales. Now, the story of Brewery Bostales, how I rolled into there, is also quite funny. My studying was coming to an end. I was still writing my thesis, but I was already looking for a job. And basically, I just made up my resume and sent it to all breweries in the neighborhood. They were the first one to respond, and they were completely looking to change their guided tours to make them more vibrant, more appealing to people. And they invited me over for a chat, and after the chat they decided I could come and do guided tours for them. So Brewery Bostales is part of ABI, so the big brewery concern, but they're actually a very traditional family brewery, which makes Karmeliet, Kwak, both very famous beers in the meantime. Kwak because of its very special glass, but they also use the newest techniques, the most modern brewery equipment, so it offers me a chance to learn and teach about both tradition, history, but also about brewery techniques in general. So just as well, if you're more into walking and seeing beautiful towns, you can go with Beer Walk. If you want to learn more about how breweries actually work, I would obviously recommend visiting Brewery Bostales. Or if you're spending time in Belgium for a longer time, just do both, because I think it's both an amazing way to get to know Belgium, to see aspects of our country and our beer culture, and of course it's a wonderful way of spending time with me. So just as well, when you visit Brewery Bostales, you can't ask to hang out with me. But if I'm not there, obviously there will be one of my awesome colleagues guiding you around. They're all awesome people because they all do this with a passion. It's not just people who have to give this guided tour. No, they're all people who are passionate about beer, who learned appreciating beer in a lot of different ways, and now they just want to share that passion. They want to share their experience of how it is like to drink beer and love beer. They want to share it with people. So just visit the website of Brewery Bostales, book yourself a tour once the COVID lockdown is over, and perhaps I'll see you there. Now, those are services, the beer walk in the towns and the beer walks for Brewery Bostales. Those are services I do for other companies. They're not part of Beardbarian. You could rather say Beardbarian is part of them. But of course, I'll also be offering my own services soon. I'll be having my own beer tastings because I haven't been doing those for a very long time. So what's so important about the beer tasting is that I will teach you how to drink beer. Now, sounds rather silly because obviously you know how to raise a pint and pour it down your gullet, but all in all, I can tell you about how to look for certain flavors, how to interpret certain flavors, how to recognize certain styles, which is something that you can obviously learn online, but it's more fun to do with friends. It's more fun to do it in a live session where you're actually drinking beer. And it's also a learning moment for me. Sometimes when I'm doing these beer tastings, people will come up with descriptions of flavor that I haven't even thought of myself. Beer tasting is, after all, there's a scientific, there's a theoretical part, but obviously there's also a subjective part. Flavors, aromas, they bring back memories, they bring back your own stories, and by listening to those stories from my customers, I learn new things myself. I learn new ways of appreciating beer, which makes this job awesome to me. It's something I really, really enjoy. Apart from those, my personal beer tastings, which I will do with beers from all kinds of breweries in Belgium, depending on what my customers like, depending on what kind of stories they want to hear. I'm also starting up my own brewery. It's a very small brewery. I hope to be making 500 to 1,000 liters a month. Might be more, might be less. Time will tell. But I think a very essential part of my brewery is that on one hand I want to join the craft beers movement, which is all about experimenting, looking for new limits in making beer. On the other hand, being a historian, being a guide and living in Belgium, I also want to get more in touch with the traditions we have. I want to experiment with techniques we use in Belgium. I want to experiment with ingredients that are typical for my country, and I want to look into ingredients that used to be typical, that used to be very popular, but that we don't use anymore or don't use as often anymore. So I hope to be offering interesting beers that offer that blend of history, of authenticity, but also offer you something new. So at this moment the brewery is still under construction. It's going to take a little bit more time to get all the permits, but I'm really looking forward to get started. Now the reason why I want to do my own brewing is because the way of making beer, it's always been a little bit magical. People have always had superstitions about beer. In Belgium we have a lot of beer saints, saints that brewers prayed to make their beer good. Even though they did have an understanding of how fermentation and brewing worked, they did have a tiny, almost instinctive understanding of that way. They still had the superstition because they couldn't obviously fix all their problems, and that's why they had these weird rules. So a little bit of that magic still lives on. The fermentation is still a very sensitive part of brewing which you can't control, but sometimes you'll still get surprises, a certain way the yeast reacts with your ingredient, a certain element of the temperature that will change the way your yeast behaves. So that's still very intriguing, and it's a thing you almost cannot speed up. You just have to let the yeast do its work, and the end result is like this combination, this cooperation between the brewer, the ingredient, and the yeast, which makes it a very lovely thing, and which makes it for me also again a learning experience. You can't stop learning. Every time you make a new beer, you will learn new aspects of beer brewing. You will learn new aspects of flavor and tasting. So that's something I'm really looking forward to get more into that. On the other hand, the more I brew, the more I learn about brewing, the more I can tell my own customers during the tasting, during the guided tours about how the beer world works. So I'm really, I said it a lot, I'm going to say a lot more. I'm really looking forward to do it myself and of course share this experience with you guys. Now you can imagine, while dabbling in all that beer, beer has a pretty big influence on my personal life, or maybe it's the influence it's had on my personal life that made me consider a career in beer, beer career if you want. First of all, of course, I visit a lot of places that have to do with beer. Personal favorite of mine are the beer festivals in Belgium, especially Bruges. Bruges has become a personal favorite of mine. I go there every year just to try a lot of different beers. Usually we'll even split the beer with friends so we can taste more different ones. You can go there, you can find the Belgian favorites of course, you can find Duvel, you can find Karmeliet, you can find Leffe even, I think. But of course you also find a lot of craft breweries. Belgium's finest will be there, letting you taste their beer. It's a great way of getting to know new styles. The general atmosphere of hanging around with people who enjoy beer there is amazing, and because you can't be drinking all day long, you obviously can take a break, go walk in the city, go hunt for food and history. So all in all, if you want to visit Belgium, look if there's any beer festivals going on during that time, because it's a great way to get to know our culture. Another way that beer has a massive impact on my personal life is of course that all my friends know I'm involved in beer. A lot of my friends did get into good beers over the past few years, and they always come up either with questions about beer, they want to get to know more beers, or sometimes they present me with beers they've discovered that I don't know yet. So it's a nice it's nicely going back and forth, getting to know a lot of new stuff, and sometimes I can even tell them a bit of new stuff about the beers they have been trying. Now, this often leads to hunting for beers, going looking for really rare beers, trying the wildest beers that you just on the menu, try to drink an entire menu, and of course, as it often goes, register all these beers with apps. I'll probably talk about beer apps in one of my future videos of beer musings, so stay in touch with the channel of course to learn more about those. And then of course there's the visiting of pubs. Belgium has a long tradition of pubs, a lot of European countries have, of course. But there's something about Belgian pubs, the way people behave there, the way people drink there, that makes them typically Belgian. And also the food they offer is very often typically traditional Belgian. Now, if you book one of your beer visits through Beardbarian, it's possible, if you ask me questions about what pub should I visit, where can I get a nice meal, sure, I can arrange that for you. I can arrange for you a place in a nice pub. I can arrange a nice menu for you if you want to learn more about Belgium. So if you ever make a booking for a walk, a history walk, a beer walk, doesn't matter, just ask and I'll be more than happy to help you out. So that's been my talk about beer and the Beardbarian. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and perhaps I'll see you while sharing a nice pint of Belgian ale.
You are my dream.